everyone, I hope you guys are having a great day. So last week we introduced the idea of prejudice and we talked about the different components of that kind of attitude. Today we're going to pick up with that lecture talking about the causes of prejudice and ways to reduce prejudice, and we'll also start off with a little bit of information about how individuals who are the victim of prejudice are impacted by it. So you will have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. But one thing to note is that this is activity 11. Remember that you have 2 drop grades for activities, which means that if you got full credit on activities 1 through 10, then you technically don't have to complete activities 11 and 12. But if you missed an activity or did not get full credit for an activity, this would be an opportunity for you to keep doing the activities to earn extra points or to make up for that. Okay? So let me know if you have any questions about that. Also, please remember that you need to be making an appointment to take exam 4 as the proctored exam. I would be happy to answer any questions or help with any way that you guys need me with that. Okay? So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, so picking up where we left off last week, talking about prejudice, today we're going to start off by talking about the effects of prejudice on an individual who is the victim of prejudice. And there's a very important concept here called a self-fulfilling prophecy. I feel like I have probably mentioned this several times during the semester, but a self-fulfilling prophecy is when you believe something, therefore you behave in a way that makes it true, even if it wouldn't have necessarily been true beforehand. So let's say, for example, that there is an institutional discrimination, or that there's this prejudice that has become institutionalized where the entire society believes it. Then perhaps the individuals who are the victim of this prejudice, they would have been as intelligent as anyone else. But if everyone in society believes that they would be unintelligent, then perhaps they would not receive the educational resources that they needed. Therefore, they would not get that kind of education they needed. They would not be as intelligent as they would have been. They won't reach their full potential. And then society can pat itself on the back and say, yeah, see, I was right. So we create this negative self-fulfilling prophecy where if, for example, someone who is the victim of prejudice, someone believes something negative about them, then they're likely to treat that person in a negative way that can then end up confirming their original belief. So this is a very, very dangerous thing. And of course, if we're talking about treating someone differently because of a prejudice, this is discrimination, right? Okay, so another thing to think about when we're talking about ways that individuals are impacted by prejudice, stereotype threat. It says the victim of prejudice may internalize stereotypes and experience anxiety about confirming that stereotype. So when we're talking about stereotype threat, if you know that someone has a negative belief about you or a negative expectation, you want to prove them wrong, right? But the problem is that that causes a lot of anxiety. Like, for example, maybe if someone they know that someone thinks that they're not intelligent, then they feel like they have to prove that they are. But that extra anxiety, that extra pressure, could actually create a negative self-fulfilling prophecy where if you're anxious, you may not perform as well as you would have beforehand, right? So when you know that someone has a negative belief about you, maybe you don't want to confirm that stereotype, but that puts a lot of extra pressure on you, right? So it is the apprehension experienced by members of a group that their behavior might confirm a cultural stereotype. So I give you an example. There's a Jewish individual that I know, and I was not aware that there is a stereotype that Jewish people are stingy with their money. I had never heard of this before, but this individual told me that he tended to over-tip like a waitress because didn't want people to think that he fit in that stereotype, right? So sometimes when we know that people expect something of us, and if it's a negative thing, then we try to prove them wrong, but that puts a lot of pressure on us, right? And can create a lot of anxiety. Okay. So here's a concrete example of stereotype threat and gender. So when I talk about stereotype threat, I'm just talking about being afraid of confirming a negative belief someone has about you. So there is a stereotype that men are better at math than women. Now, first of all, before I get into this, let me just clarify that the research shows that men do tend to do better than women at complex math, a little bit, and we could talk about whether that's nature or nurture, but typically when you're talking about just like basic arithmetic, there is no gender difference. However, we have this stereotype, we have this belief, right? So they did a research study to try to figure out whether or not stereotype threat would impact performance. Women typically know that this stereotype, that they're not going to do as well in math as men. In fact, there was a Barbie doll at one point that said math is hard. This was obviously a long time ago, but we have this stereotype built into our culture, this belief, right? So the independent variable, the thing that they were manipulating here, was the information that they gave the women. So some of the women were told, you're just going to do a basic math test. On the other hand, some of the women were told, you're going to do a basic math test to see if you really do perform less well than men do, or we're going to compare your performance to the performance of men to try to find out if it's true that men do better than women. And then the dependent variable, the thing that they're measuring, is the women's performance. So some of these women will have that stereotype threat activated where they know that they're being compared to men and that people are not expecting them to do well. Whereas some of these women are not having that stereotype threat activated because they think they're just taking a math test, right? So what do you think happened? Well, the women who were told that the math test was designed to show gender differences did not perform as well as men. Think about this. These women then were told, we're going to compare you to men. So perhaps that made them anxious. They wanted to represent women well. It caused a lot of anxiety, and they did not do as well. However, if they were told that it was just a regular math test, we're not trying to detect male-female differences, it's just a math test, then women and men performed equally well. So this stereotype maybe isn't true, but we create it and make it true when we put this extra pressure, this extra anxiety on an individual that then does harm their performance. So just something to think about when we're talking about stereotypes. Okay? So we're going to spend the rest of today's lecture talking about what causes prejudice and how to reduce prejudice, because we need to know what causes it before we can talk about how to get rid of prejudice, right? So first of all, talking about reasons for prejudice. Remember that prejudice is just having a belief or treating someone or feeling some way about someone just because of their group membership, right? Why do we have this prejudice? And we know that we do, and I don't know that it would be possible to completely get rid of prejudice, right? Normative conformity, right? If you remember normative social influence, that we go along with other people because we want to fit in with the group. This is one reason why we have prejudice, because if the other people in our group are demonstrating some kind of prejudice, we're likely to go along with them. That doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with them or that we think that their prejudice is accurate or helpful, but we go along with it anyway because we want to fit in. Also, remember, normative conformity or that normative social influence means, we want to fit into the group. We talked about group processes, about how we tend to hang out with people who are similar to us, and the more time we spend with them, the more similar we become, and this leads us to leave out other people. So at this point, we just want to fit in, and we just want to go along with everyone else in our group, but this does create a separation between groups, as you'll see. So prejudice cannot happen if we don't have groups, right? The first step in prejudice is creating groups, putting people in groups based on some characteristics. So now we have us and them. Now, groups are not necessarily a bad thing. We talked about how there are benefits to groups, how they give us our social norms, how they give us part of our identity, right? So the groups are important. So we haven't done anything wrong by putting people in groups. Actually, this kind of categorization is very, very important, and it's emphasized in our educational system, right? When we're talking about, we teach children the difference between mammals versus reptiles, we put animals in groups. And when we do this with every subject that you study, you put information in groups. We do it with people as well. This is supposed to help us. It's supposed to make our life more simple if we can understand information and categorize it. However, it can have some profound implications, as we'll see. But just putting people into groups isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is the first step in prejudice. So think about the groups that you belong to, right? Maybe you think of yourself as a group as MUW student. So that means maybe that you have certain feelings about other people who are in that group with you, right? Other MUW students versus students at another university. Maybe you put yourself in the group as being a senior or a junior, or a sophomore, or freshman. Maybe it's a psychology major. There are so many groups that we are a part of, right? And so that does impact the way that we see other people. We are in our group and other people are in an out group. This leads to an in-group bias. Positive feelings and special treatment for people we have defined as being part of our in-group, and negative feelings and unfair treatment for others simply because we have defined them as being in the out-group. So an in-group would just be other people who are part of your group who spend time around you, whereas the out-group would be those other people, right? Now, we know that this happens, that there are some people in your life that you give special treatment to, and some people that you don't. Maybe your family is your in-group, and everybody else is the out group when it comes to family. Maybe your friends are your in group. Maybe your coworkers. You know that there are people in your life that you give special treatment to. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We can't give special treatment to everyone because that would wear us out, and also because then nobody gets special treatment if everybody gets special treatment, right? So we know that we provide extra benefits to our families, to our friends, that we wouldn't necessarily give to everyone. That's not necessarily a bad thing unless this extends to the point that we are now mistreating people who are not part of our in-group. So your in-group would just be people that you consider who are like you and who are in your group. So when you talk about a group of people who interact with each other and need each other, I give the example here because I also teach at Mississippi State. There's a very big rivalry between Mississippi State and Ole Miss, right? So it's like Mississippi State is our in-group, and Ole Miss is our out-group. And we have these negative feelings about people who are in our out-group, and we like the people who are in our in-group, right? That's okay as long as you don't start mistreating Ole Miss fans, right? Very good. All right, so the main reason that we do this is self-esteem. Think about this. We like people who are in our group, and we know that we form groups based on similarities, and we know that we are in our group. We like ourselves, therefore we like people who spend time around us and people who are like us, right? Self-esteem. We are in certain groups, and our self-esteem is tied to those groups. Our group membership tells us something about who we are, but that only feels good as long as our group is special. So it says self-esteem is enhanced only if the individual sees these groups as superior to other groups, right? So when we start saying, well, our team is better than your team, that's because we need the self-esteem to feel like our group is special. If you're in a group that is not special, that is not doing well, then that doesn't help your self-esteem. So then we convince ourselves that our group is superior to other people's groups, because then that enhances our self-esteem. And self-esteem is a good thing. We know that we need self-esteem, that people become depressed and lack motivation when they don't have enough self-esteem. But this could obviously go too far if you're mistreating people who are in your out-group, right? So just to summarize, an in-group would be the people that you spend time with, that you consider as part of your group. We give them special benefits, and we think that they're better than other people only because we have a need for high self-esteem. We need to feel like our group is best to make us feel good about ourselves. But unfortunately, if there is a winner, there's also a loser. If there's someone who's superior, there's also someone who's inferior. So when we try to convince ourselves that our group is best in order to improve our self-esteem, that also means that we are putting down other people, and this is where we're starting to get into a problem here, right? One way that researchers have studied in-group bias is to create entities they refer to as minimal groups. But basically what they did here was they took strangers who were not familiar with each other at all, and then they put them into groups based on some random factor, right? So one thing they did was they had like a coin toss, right? And they would randomly assign you into groups. You can like assign people based on shirt color, like just something totally random, some random factor you put people into groups, okay? Now, because we have random selection here, think about what we know about research. Random selection means, and random assignment means that the group should be equivalent, right? There's no reason why one group should be better at anything than another group. They were randomly selected, right? So theoretically, these groups should be equivalent. However, that's not how the participants behaved. Even though they were strangers before they got started, the group members liked their own members better, right? So you were randomly assigned into a group with a bunch of strangers. There's another group that's randomly assigned they're strangers as well. But somehow you feel like your members are better than the other members, even though you don't know them, you never met them before today, and you really don't have time to get to know them. Still, you feel like the people who are in your group are better. Why do we do this? Well, I think part of this is in our individualistic society where self-esteem is so incredibly important, and where we tend to like ourselves a lot, then just the fact that I'm in this group makes it superior, right? Just because you're in a group with me means you're better than those other people, right? We tend to have very high self-esteem in our country, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, right? But even though they don't know these people, they think that the people who are in their group are better than the people who are in the other group. Remember how these groups were selected. Coin toss, totally random. There's no reason why your group should be better than another group, but we still convince ourselves that, right? They rated members of their in-group as being more likely to have pleasant personalities and to have done better work. Just because you're in a group with me, I feel like you're a nicer person and you work harder, right? And they allocated more rewards to those who shared their label. So they were more likely to share things and give things to people who were part of their group, right? This doesn't really make sense when we're talking about being in a group of people who are strangers for a short period of time, and we develop this bias almost immediately, right? However, if this happens in a lab almost immediately with total strangers, don't you think that there would be a much stronger effect when you're talking about people who are in your group in real life all day long, every day, right? That it would be very, very quickly, people would develop this in-group bias in a very strong way, and that would perhaps lead to discrimination. Because if we start to have this belief that our group is better than another group, and maybe that belief was, we had a good intention here of just improving our own self-esteem and taking care of our friends, but that could quickly lead to us having these negative beliefs, these negative stereotypes about people who are not in our group, which could then lead to discrimination, right? So it's a slippery slope, right? Part of the reason why we have this bias towards people that are in our group and we treat the people in our group a certain way is because of the beliefs that we have about people who are in our out group. Just remember that in-group are people that are spending time around you, that you have a group that are part of your group. An out-group would be people who are not in your group, right? Out-group homogeneity, the belief that they are all alike. Typically, we think that if we've met one of them, we've met all of them. And then I say them, right? People who are in our out group, right? Like, for example, if you're a Mississippi State fan, you feel like all Ole Miss fans are a certain way, and you have these strong feelings about them, right? You don't necessarily have to get to know them. You just can automatically assume that they are all alike. However, you would say that Mississippi State fans are diverse. They're a diverse group, right? They have a lot of different characteristics, all of which are positive, right? If they're part of your in-group, right? So in-group members tend to perceive out-group members as being more similar than they really are, right? Now, this helps us maintain our stereotype, because if they really are all the same, then whatever beliefs we have about one person should apply to the rest of them as well. Now, obviously, we know that this is typically inaccurate. The reason we do this is that it saves us a lot of time. We don't have to get to know the other people. We can just make assumptions about them and go on our way. The problem is, though, that you make a lot of mistakes here when you assume that just because someone is in an out group, they have negative characteristics, and just because someone is in your in group, they have positive characteristics. We make a lot of mistakes with our attributions here when that happens, but the idea is that we don't necessarily know we made a mistake because we don't necessarily go and try to confirm or deny or disconfirm our beliefs. We just assume they're true and we go on about our merry way. Okay? So, when we're talking about things that cause prejudice and the causes of prejudice, we have to go back and review a little bit some of the material from earlier in the semester. So this lecture is going to include a lot of our previously covered material and kind of put it in perspective related to prejudice. So we talked about attributions, right? We talked about internal versus external attributions. An internal attribution or a dispositional attribution means that this person is behaving this way because of who they are, whereas a situational or an external attribution means they're behaving that way because of their situation. So anyone in that situation would probably behave that way, right? Now, it says one reason stereotypes are so insidious and persistent is we do have a tendency to make dispositional attributions. If you'll remember, this just means that when we see someone behave a certain way, we assume it's because of who they are. We don't necessarily know much about their situation, so we make an assumption. When you see someone being kind, you say, oh, that's a kind person. When you see someone being mean, you say, oh, that's a mean person. You don't necessarily take the situation into account very often, right? However, sometimes this leads us to make mistakes, and you can see how this is related to prejudice, right? If you see an out-group member behaving in a way that you consider negative, you immediately say, oh, see, that person is having this negative behavior because of some negative personality characteristic or something about them, right? And if you feel like everyone in the out-group is all the same, then when you see one out-group member misbehave, you assume that they all will, right? And so this can become a problem very quickly. We can make a lot of mistakes here, right? I think that we talked about the ultimate attribution error earlier in the semester, but it is just our tendency to make dispositional attributions about everything, where we feel like when we see someone do something, it's because of who they are. So then if you take that and you say, okay, this one individual who did this behavior that I don't like is behaving that way because of who they are, and then you say, well, and also it's because of their group membership, because they're all alike, then you start applying these beliefs to people that you've never even met, that you have no information about, and you make errors here. Now, this is intended to make our life easier. It's intended to save us a lot of cognitive effort. However, obviously, a lot of mistakes can be made here, and we have to be careful with this. It's a very slippery slope, prejudice. Alright, so one of the reasons why this is a problem is that it can lead to blaming the victim, which I think that we referred to earlier in the semester. But when we're talking about making an internal attribution, sometimes we do this when someone has had some kind of trauma or something terrible happen to them. So we see someone who is a victim when we make an internal attribution or a dispositional attribution, and we say it was something about that person that caused them to be victimized, right? And obviously this is wrong. I just want to say at this point, as I've said during the earlier lectures, we should not do this. This is absolutely, utterly wrong. No one asks to be traumatized. No one deserves to be traumatized. And yet we do this, right? And this obviously then can hurt our empathy. If we feel like someone who's had something negative happen to them, it happened to them because of who they are, and maybe because of their group membership, then we don't have to feel bad for them. We feel like they brought it on themselves. So what happens if we look at people who are not in our group, so people who are in our out group, the people that we have a prejudice against, we see something bad happening to them, and we say, oh, well, it's their fault that it's happening. That then means that we don't have to do anything about it. And also, that means that it won't happen to us, right? So if we can say, well, the negative things that are happening to that group of people are because of who they are, then that makes us feel safe because we're not in that group, which means it won't happen to us, which is, of course, faulty logic because bad things happen to everyone, right? The example that you usually hear when we talk about blaming the victim would be rape victims, which rape is a horrific thing that, as I've said, no one deserves this, no one brings this on themselves, but we hear these horrific things like it's their fault because of the way they behaved or the way that they dressed or where they were or whatever the case may be, which no one asks to be raped and no one deserves this. But we do this because we feel like if we can put that person in an out group that's different from me, then it won't happen to me, right? So if we can say, then somehow we feel like we can protect ourselves from it. And there may be some situations where we can avoid a bad situation, but a lot of times when bad things happen, there wasn't anything we could do to avoid it, right? But the reason we do this is to try to protect ourselves. And not only for ourselves here, but this also helps protect our in-group, right? The idea that if there's some personality characteristic that applies to the out-group that led to them being victimized, not only does that protect me because I don't have that personality characteristic, but no one in my in-group has that personality characteristic, and therefore I can feel like I'm protecting my friends and my family, right? And this helps us sleep better at night. And that's fine in that it's important for us to find ways to sleep at night and find ways to cope with the world. The problem is when we lack empathy and we are not caring for other people, and when we're blaming the victim, it can lead to discrimination here, which is obviously a very negative thing. Alright, so the justification suppression model of prejudice Remember our cognitive dissonance discussion, where you have a belief and a behavior that are not necessarily lining up with each other, and that creates cognitive dissonance, right? And that uncomfortable feeling. Well, most people believe that they are good people, that they are not prejudiced. However, maybe there's some prejudiced behavior, some discrimination going on. So we have to figure out a way to balance that, right? Now, remember the ways to reduce cognitive dissonance. A, change the behavior. B, change the belief. Or C, add a justification, right? So, what we could do here is we could change the behavior and stop discriminating against other people. That would reduce our cognitive dissonance. Or we can change our belief that prejudice is wrong. That would make us feel good also. But it's hard to stop our behavior, right? It's hard to change if we've been discriminating. And then we don't really want to change our belief that prejudice is wrong, because if we believe that prejudice is okay, that makes us a bad person. And so oftentimes people go with option C and they find a justification, right? So, to conserve energy, they tend to seek a valid justification for holding a negative attitude toward a particular outgroup, right? So I can keep my belief that prejudice is wrong. I can keep my discriminatory behavior because I tell myself this group deserves it, or this group, it's not prejudice, it's just fact, right? And that will allow me then to feel good about myself and not have this cognitive dissonance, right? So, typically someone who has a prejudice, they will go out and they will look for examples that fit with their prejudice. So if they see a member of an outgroup behaving in a way that does not fit their prejudice, they tend to disregard that or not pay attention to that. But as soon as they see a member of an outgroup behaving in a way that confirms, quote unquote, confirms their prejudice, then they will cling to that example and they will use that as a valid justification. I say valid also in quotes. The idea here, then, is that I can feel like I'm a good person, and I can still hold my beliefs and my behavior because it's justified, right? So, then, obviously, everything up until this point has been leading us to the question, how can prejudice be reduced? Obviously, we want to stop prejudice. But if prejudice happens because we put people in groups, then we may not be able to stop prejudice because we're not going to be able to stop putting people in groups. So, however, we can reduce prejudice at least, right? Now, some people would say, well, the way to reduce prejudice is just to put people together with other people and show them demonstrations of people who don't fit into their stereotypes, right? When people are presented with an example that seems to refute their existing stereotype, they don't change their belief. In fact, it often strengthens their beliefs, right? So the idea here is that all we need to do is to take people who have this stereotype and present them with examples of people who don't fit their stereotype, and that should reduce the stereotype, right? Actually, that doesn't work. Like, let's say, for example, there are people who believe that women are not good at math, and then we show them examples of women who are excellent mathematicians. That doesn't make them believe that women are better at math, right? Or that they are as good at men as men at math. That actually can strengthen their stereotypical belief that women are not good at math. And you think, how can that happen? When I'm presenting you with an example of people who don't line up with your belief, how does that strengthen your belief? Well, maybe because, remember we talked about attitude change, about how if you know that someone is trying to change your attitude, then you can be prepared to combat that. We talked about how that was a good thing when you're training teenagers to not give in to peer pressure and that kind of thing. But if an individual senses that you are threatening their stereotypes that maybe they like holding, then they will be very defensive about it and might actually end up holding the belief more strongly. So just giving them examples of people who don't fit into their prejudice, that's not going to be enough to reduce prejudice. So what about just bringing people in contact, right? Mere contact between groups does not reduce prejudice. It's not sufficient to reduce prejudice. So you might think that, well, they're just not spending enough time around out-group members. If we just force the in-group members to spend time with the out-group members, that will get rid of the prejudice, right? Not necessarily, okay? Can actually increase opportunities for conflict. So conflict happens when one group's beliefs or motivations or desires don't line up with the of another group. So if you force these people together under less than optimal conditions, they may just fight. or they may just disagree, or they may just stay in the groups they were in when they got there and not even talk to each other. So just bringing people together is not enough. What we need to do is, first of all, make sure that the groups are of equal status. So we don't need one group who is in charge or one group who is bossing around the other group. And we also need them to share a common goal. Remember what makes people a group, right? We said it's usually 2 to 6-ish members who interact with each other and need each other, right? If we can take this out group and this in group and put them together and give them a common goal, then they are one big group now, right? This makes them a group because we need each other. We're depending on each other. Think about like sports movies where one team doesn't like the other team, but they have to come together and work together, and then they do end up getting along. We have a common goal. We need to go win the championship, so we have to find a way to work together, right? If we give them a common goal, they're more likely to get along. Because somehow that makes the out-group members now part of my in-group. So, first of all, mutual interdependence and common goal. So when we bring together in-group and out-group, they need to need each other. They need to be working together, because then that will give them the motivation they need to start to get to know each other. Also, as we said, equal status. So we need to make sure that one group is not somehow above the other group, okay? Now, it needs to be a friendly, informal setting where they have a chance to get to know each other before maybe we force them to start working together, kind of a laid-back, more comfortable setting. And the more you know out-group members, the less likely you are to hold this prejudice, maybe because you get to see that there is some variety. Remember that out-group homogeneity, where we think that everyone who's not in our group is all the same? Well, the more people that you know who are not in your group, the more you'll see that's not accurate, so that can weaken prejudice. And then also social norms of equality, so it would help if we had this belief that all men are created equal, and women as well, right? That we are all created equally as part of our society, because we do internalize these social norms, and then that does influence our behavior. Alright, so there is a relatively well-known demonstration that I want to talk to you guys about that happened in Jane Elliott's third grade classroom. So she was a third grade teacher who did this demonstration the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And the idea was that she wanted to demonstrate to her students what it would feel like to be discriminated against. So what she did was she set up this hierarchy based on eye color. So she told the blue-eyed children that they were the superior group. So they were going to have more power and more special privileges versus the students who were brown-eyed, who were in an inferior group, right? So she based the students into groups based on eye color, and found that very quickly they began to take on these roles. I mean, think about what we talked about with the Stanford Prison Study about how being in these social roles, even if they're arbitrarily assigned, can very quickly impact our behavior. So they did find that the blue-eyed children started to see the brown-eyed children as an out-group and to be prejudiced against them, right? Very, very quickly. It didn't take long at all. So the blue-eyed children then formed an in-group, and being myself a green-eyed person, I do wonder where she put the green-eyed people, but they formed an in-group, and so they saw themselves as being different from the brown-eyed children. So if you think about this, when you form an in-group, then you treat the people who are in your in-group, they get special privileges, and you treat them better than you treat the people who were in the out-group. So they saw the children who were brown-eyed as being somehow inferior to them, and they treated them that way, right? The purpose of this was to let the children know what it felt like to be discriminated against, right? The blue-eyed children, to them, the brown-eyed children seemed different from them. They were suddenly that out-group homogeneity. They're all the same, and they're different from us. Now, this is a very controversial demonstration here, and this is actually what your activity is going to be related to this week. They're on both sides of the debate here. On the one side, there there was a situation where during this time period discrimination was rampant, and these children, how could they have possibly understood it if they haven't experienced it for themselves? If you know anything about the theories of Piaget and developmental psychology, that children of this age range do best with concrete examples and something that they can actually see. They don't do so well with abstract examples. So the idea here was to give them a concrete example so that they could actually understand something that is very difficult to understand. On the other side of the debate, though, we are potentially doing psychological harm to children by kind of forcing this prejudice upon them, right? So this goes into activity 11 this week. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but I want you guys to think critically about this demonstration. So just splitting children up based on something like eye color and labeling one group as inferior, one group as superior. The purpose here, and the children were later explained to them, and I think she even reversed the study and later let the brown-eyed children be superior and the blue-eyed children be inferior. The idea here was to try to let them see what it felt like to be discriminated against. So I want you to tell me, do you think this demonstration was ethical? And then why or why not? So if you thought that it was a good idea to do this study, tell me why you think it was a good idea. If you didn't think it was a good idea, tell me why it's not a good idea. And then also tell me, if you were a parent and your child was in this classroom and had this activity or this demonstration that they were kind of made to take part in, how would you feel about that? Would you be grateful that the teacher helped your child understand a very difficult concept, or would you be perhaps angry that the teacher, without really consulting you, force this prejudice upon your child? So there are a lot of different thoughts here. I just want to get your opinions in the activity this week. So the last little bit of material, implicit prejudice is a prejudice that we are not aware that we hold. So explicit means that a prejudice that we know that we have, that we can explain to other people. Implicit prejudice is one that we're not necessarily aware of. So then you ask the question, how can it be prejudice if we don't know that we hold this prejudice? And where does an implicit prejudice come from? One that we're not even aware of. And I think probably a lot of our prejudice is implicit, right? We said that everyone has prejudice, that it affects everyone, and that if we're not aware of it, we might not report it on a measure, if somebody starts asking us questions. However, that doesn't mean that we're not influenced by it. That doesn't mean that it can't still lead to discrimination. So yes, it is still a prejudice even if we're not aware of it. And I feel like implicit prejudice usually comes from an outside source. Maybe we watch our parents, or we overhear our parents and we model them. Maybe it's something like society feels a certain way about a certain group of people, and we somehow internalize that without even realizing it. Children, very often, they believe whatever you tell them. And so if they have heard something about a group of people, they may not be able to understand that this person is just prejudiced or biased. They assume that it's true. And so we have this implicit prejudice that we've internalized that can still impact our behavior. So what happens then when a member of an outgroup doesn't meet our stereotypes? Well, first of all, when a member of an outgroup, so someone who is not like us, behaves in a way that is consistent with our stereotype, then we feel like that confirms and strengthens our stereotype. So if we see an individual who lines up with our stereotype, what we expected, we say, aha, see, I'm right, and we pay attention to that. So what do we do when an outgroup member behaves in a way that does not match up with our stereotype? Well, we said earlier that when you see a demonstration of someone who does not meet your stereotype, typically that doesn't reduce our stereotype. We said earlier it might even increase our stereotype if it makes us feel defensive. How does that happen? How do we still hold on to our stereotype even when we see examples of outgroup members and we see that they're not all the same, that outgroup homogeneity is not accurate? How do we manage to hang on to our stereotypes even in the face of evidence against them? Well, it all goes back to that cognitive dissonance and kind of manipulating the information in our mind, right? Engaging in some attributional fancy footwork here. The idea is that we typically make a dispositional or internal attribution for most situations. We see someone do something and we assume they're doing it because of who they are. However, if we see a person who is a member of an outgroup who is behaving in a positive way that doesn't line up with our stereotype, then all we have to do is make a situational or external attribution, right? The only reason they're behaving that way is because of this situation. They really are how we believe that they are. They really do fit in with that stereotype. It's just because of the situation, they're pretending that they're not, or it's just not showing up in this particular situation, right? So we could say then that there's some kind of exception here, something about the environment that is changing, but really that is truly who they are. That allows us to see an example of someone in an outgroup who doesn't meet our expectations and still hold on to our stereotype. Right? So that is the end of the lecture for this week. So if you have any questions about the material on prejudice, please let me know. We do have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. If you need anything, I do have office hours, so feel free to come by. Also, remember that we need to start thinking about Exam 4, making sure that we have an appointment to take it as a proctored exam. Next week, we will have our last lecture video talking about aggression. So if you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.